We have it in ourselves. We have it within us, writes author Frederick Buechner, to be Christ to each other, and maybe in some unimaginable way to God too. We have it in us, Buechner continues, to work miracles of love and healing as well as to have them worked upon us. We have it in us to bless with Him and forgive with Him and heal with Him, and once in a while maybe even to grieve with some measure of His grief at another's pain, and to rejoice with some measure of His rejoicing at another's joy, almost as if it were our own. We have it in us. When Jesus called those disciples, Simon, Thaddeus, Judas, James, John, Peter, all of them, He called them to be Christ to this world. And He believed that somehow they had it in them to be just that. In the gospel that Karen just read, Jesus calls those disciples and then sends them out in the world to do exactly what He has been doing Himself. To heal the sick, to bear the burdens of others, to lift the bonds of oppression and poverty, to cast out all that would demean and demonize human life, to offer good news. In a word, He calls them to be Christ to this world. And He believes that that they have it within them to do just that. Even Simon, called the Rock, who will crumble at the least resistance, the one who would deny Jesus not once but 3 times. Some kind of rock. But Jesus still believed that Simon had it in him to do what needed to be done and to be Christ for this world. All of them. And my brothers and sisters, that is our call too. To bear Christ in this world. Individually and as a church. To do all those things that He was doing. And notice that there's not in this passage a whole lot about the liturgical aspect. He's not calling them to be priests. He's not calling them to baptize or to celebrate communion or to do priestly kinds of things. So this is not just limited to the clergy. We're all in this together. All of us and all of them. To be Christ to this world. And my brothers and sisters, that is the call and the claim that God has on each of our lives. To be Christ to this world. A young woman named Ramsina, a young Kurdish woman aged 25 who lives in Erbil, Iraq, understands that call and that claim. And she understands that somehow God knows that she has it within her to respond to that call. I met Ramsina during the time that I was in Iraq this last week. Spent most of every day with her and a couple other people who work for something called Prosperity Catalyst, which is a women's empowerment organization that works in the camps in Iraq. It's sponsored, one of the sponsors is the Disciples of Christ Week of Compassion. And as many of you know, I went with the head of the Week of Compassion, plus one other man, to Iraq to spend a little over a week working in the camps and documenting what had gone on. Ramsina was our interpreter for the interviews that we had with Iraqi women. Women who were coming, who had fled 3.5 years ago from the violence in Mosul which is only about 50 miles away from Erbil. Women who also were Yazidi women who were come from the northeastern corner of Iraq. They're basically mountain people, villagers, who when ISIS swept into that part of Iraq 3.5 years ago, and the instability that has resulted in the last 13 years in that war-torn country, ever since 2003, ISIS swept in and basically annihilated the Yazidis. The UN has officially declared what happened to those hundreds of thousands of people in the northeastern corner of Iraq as genocide. And the stories that I was told bear that out. So we visited 3 camps with the help of Ramsina. But when she's not interpreting for people like myself, she is helping to coordinate the trainers and organize the women in these Iraqi camps. Iraqi camps that are in the city of Erbil itself, because there's no other ground for them, where people have been since 2014, never allowed, other than perhaps under dire medical emergencies, to leave the few acres of dirt, dust, and sand that make up those camps. The first camp had 900 people in it, predominantly women and children. The second camp that also was near Erbil had 2,000 people in it, on an acreage maybe the size of our acreage here at the United Church of Santa Fe. People who are living in tents and trailers that were supplied by the United Nations High Commission on Refugees 3.5 years ago. Tents and trailers that are designed not to last longer than a year, because people aren't supposed to be in refugee camps for longer than a year. People whose air conditioning, we called it swamp cooler when I was growing up, doesn't work much of the time. People who are living in an area where it gets up to 105 on a regular basis. And even though I'm from Arizona, that's not the kind of dry heat I like. Ramsina organizes women's collectives to train women, many of whom are widowed or whose husbands have abandoned them, to do handcrafts and also to market those handcrafts. But even more than that, what she does is that she helps provide community for those women. Women who have lost husbands and sons, women who are single, women alone in a society where if you do not have a husband or a son or a brother to protect you and to care for you and to provide for you, you and your children will starve. And her work is to provide some kind of economic basis for these women. But she does far more than that. In the gatherings, women have an opportunity to talk about their lives. And day after day after day, week after week, 25-year-old Ramsina, herself a Chaldean Christian, and her tradition goes back a lot longer than Protestantism, back to the 2nd century in that part of the Middle East. Day after day, she walks into the darkness of those refugee camps and hears their stories. Stories beyond our imaginings. After one particular interview that I conducted with one of the Yazidi women, where Ramsina was the translator from Yazidi into Arabic, the woman was speaking in Yazidi. There was another translator translating from Yazidi into Arabic, and then Ramsina translated from Arabic to me. And there may have been a little bit lost in translation, but I guarantee you it was one story I will never forget. A story that left the woman, aged 31, in tears, that left the Yazidi translator in tears, that left the Ramsina in tears. And had I not been holding the iPhone to make the recording, I would have been in tears as well. You only have to read the UN report on the genocide of the Yazidis to know the kind of story that this woman was sharing. After the interview was over, and after the woman who was self-described as an ISIS survivor left, I turned to Ramsina and I said, how do you do it? How do you do it every single day, week after week, coming back into these camps to hear these stories? How do you carry so much grief? And she responded by saying, with a wisdom that went far beyond not only her 25 years, but my 60 plus years. She said, it helps me keep my life in perspective. When I go home and I get frustrated because I can't find something in my house, I have lost something in my house. I remember women who have lost everything. Houses, husbands, sons, daughters, everything. And then she said, I pray. I pray every day. And I go to church every Sunday. And the particular Sunday I was there, I went to church, to the Chaldean Christian Church of St. Joseph in the middle of Erbil, Iraq. And Ramsina said, when I'm there with other people who are also praying and also hearing the story and hearing and singing the songs and sharing the Mass, the bread, the cup, I get what I need to be able to go back on Monday morning. I find that I have the courage to do what I believe I am called to do. Ramsina, 25 years old, walking into camps that are filled with Sunni Muslims, Yazidis, and other Christians who have been traumatized beyond our belief and imagination, finds the courage she needs to be Christ for others. She has it in her to do just that. And my brothers and sisters, we are called as well, in whatever ways God may be calling you individually or me individually or us as a church, to find it within us as well. To find through prayer, through song, through scripture, through being the community of faith God calls us to be Christ for this world. To do what Jesus told his disciples to do what Ramsina at age 25 does. We too are called to do that. We have it in us, Frederick Buechner says, to be Christ to others. We have it in us to bless and to forgive, to heal and to care, to listen to the grief of others and to share sometimes also in their joy. That was what the disciples were called to do by Jesus, to do what he did, to be who he was. That is what Ramsina, Chaldean Christian, believes herself to be called to do and be with the Sunni Muslims, the Yazidis, and the Christians of northern Iraq. And my brothers and sisters, wherever it is that God has called you, that is what God calls you to do as well. You have it in you, just like Ramsina does. God promises to be with us, as God promised to be with those disciples, and as Ramsina reminds herself every single Sunday that God has promised to be with her, so that she can be Christ with God's help to others. That's our call too. Thanks be to God. Amen.